All right, Algebra 1. So today we begin talking about the distributive property. Say that with me, the distributive property. Whew, it's a big word. So let's take a minute and think about what it means. What are we going to be doing? The root of the word distributive is the word distribute. Distribute. I want you to think for a minute, what does distribute mean? Well, might mean if you may have had a teacher who distributes paper in class, or Miss Scott down in the lunchroom, she might distribute food to the people who come in for lunch each day. Or let's see, the mailman distributes mail all day. So distribute, if we think about those examples, distribute means to hand out, or you might think of it as to give out, like to give out a piece of paper. Or, you know what? Halloween is coming up. Let's talk candy. Let's say you go trick-or-treating and you go to, let's say you take your little brother or sister out trick-or-treating, and you go to a house, and the person who owns the house is going to give out candy. All right? Well, they're going to give some to you, and they're going to give some to your brother or sister, because that's fair, right? And if everybody doesn't get one, then, well, younger siblings start crying and fussing. It becomes this huge deal, and then you have to go home, and it's just a disaster. All right? So I want you to think about, anytime we're talking about distributing, I want you to think about giving out candy, okay? Has to go to everything. Let's talk about some properties, some general properties of distribution, so you can see what I mean. So here we have two people going trick-or-treating, and we'll say it's, I don't know, Batman and Cleopatra. Sure, everybody likes to be Cleopatra for Halloween, right? So Batman and Cleopatra go trick-or-treating, and they come to house A, the very first house they come to. The person in house A is going to distribute candy to Batman and to Cleopatra, okay? And in math, when we distribute, we are going to multiply, okay? So up here, I want you to write multiply, all right? The distributive property means we are going to go to every part and we're going to multiply it. What does that look like? Well, positive A times positive B gives me a positive A times B. And in algebra, we just write them right next to each other, and that means multiply. Positive times a positive gives me a positive A times C. Now take a look at what happened here. This A, the part that I had on the outside, is here in this term and in that term. And my B is still here, and my C is still here. So I have all three parts still represented in my answer, which is exactly what I want to see. Let's take a look at this next one, because this one now has a minus inside. That's okay. You still have Batman and Cleopatra, two separate people going trick-or-treating, and they go to house A, where the person inside distributes candy to both of them, and we multiply. So positive times a positive is positive A times B. Positive times a negative, because now this is negative, positive times a negative is a negative, and A times C. Okay? So again, A is still there in all the parts, and now B is still there, and C is still there, and everybody's happy. What if it's on the other side? Same exact thing. Distribute it to both parts. I'm going to multiply. So positive times a positive gives me a positive AB. Positive times a positive gives me a positive AC. Here again, distribute to both parts. Positive times a positive gives me a positive AB. Positive times a negative gives me negative AC. Now these last two are fancy, okay? And I pulled out another highlighter color just for these two. Wink. So for these two, what I want you to see is that out front, we don't have an actual number anymore. We do, but it's kind of hidden. Anytime you just have a negative symbol, it's actually a -1, okay? So we have a -1 outside both of these. Now watch what happens when we do that. When we distribute this -1 and we multiply times both terms, well, negative times a positive gives me a negative. 1 times A, well, that's just A. Negative times a positive gives me a negative. 1 times B, that's just B. So what happened here? We started with positive A and positive B. We ended up with negative A and negative B. Let's take a look at the second one. We distribute to both terms. Negative times a positive is a negative. 1 times A is just A. Negative times a negative, these are the same signs, so negative times a negative is a positive, and 1 times B is just B. So we started with a positive A and a negative B, and we ended with a negative A and a positive B. Do you see the pattern? Here's what it is. Anytime you multiply by a -1, all it's going to do is change the sign. So for these two, I want you to know, multiply by a -1, change the sign. Okay, repeat after me. Multiply by a -1, change the sign. That's really important, and you need to remember it, okay? So say it over and over again. Anytime you multiply by a -1, all you have to do is go through and change the signs. Now, if you multiply by a negative number, then you're going to need to do that multiplication as well, and some other things will change. But for now, multiply by a -1 just changes the sign, okay? So let's take a look at some examples. Number 45. On the outside, I have 9. On the inside, I have 1 and positive 6b. All right, so here's what we're going to do. I'm going to distribute this 9 to both terms. Positive times a positive gives me a positive. 9 times 1 gives me 9. Positive times a positive 9 times a positive 6 gives me a positive. 9 times 6 is 54. And there isn't a variable, so the b just stays attached. We'll multiply that way, keeping them right next to each other. Now take a look at 47. This time we're going to distribute a negative number. We're going to distribute a negative to a +1 and a positive 8n. No sweat. Distribute, distribute, we got this. -9 times a +1 gives me -9. -9 times +8 gives me a -72. And there's nothing being multiplied by the end, so it just comes along for the ride. It's still being multiplied. That's why we wrote it right next to each other. Okay, but it's not going to change. Why don't you take a look at 46 and 48, pause the video, and come back when you think you've got the right answer. How'd you do? Did you get 45 minus 5b and 50x minus 90? I hope you did. Let's take a look at another few examples together. 49 and 50. All right, so I'm going to distribute here and distribute here. And you can color code if you want to, just to kind of keep everything straight. There we go. Okay, so -10 times 1 is -10. -10 times -5, well, a negative times a negative is a positive, and 10 times 5 is 50. And the k is still being multiplied, so I added into that term as well. How about for number 50? I have a negative that I'm going to distribute into an A and a -9. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to multiply it by each term. So remember there's a 1 here. So -9 times 1 is -9, and A is being multiplied as well. So -9 times A is just -9A. Negative times a negative is a positive. 9 times 9 is 81. So -9A plus 81. Why don't you take a look at 51? Come on back when you think you've got it. 60x plus 100. Did you get it? I hope you did. Why don't you try these last few problems for homework? Bring them into class, and if you have any questions, of course, we'll talk about them together. Be sure to put a star or write your question, or if there's something that just feels weird, ask me about it. I want to help. So have a great night, and we'll see you in class.